Good evening and welcome to the first show of the new 2023 year. It's episode 42 of Jay's Retro Toys and Games. I'm your host, Jason DeCanio, and we're happy that you are with us here for the 2023 year. Hope you had a great Christmas and a safe New Year as well. We're looking at a game tonight, a game that takes the role of an Indian cross and circle game called Pachisi. They move 3 or 4 pieces around the board, attempting to get all of their pieces home before any other player. It's originally manufactured by W.H. Storey and Company in England, and now by Hasbro. This game is marketed for 2 to 4 players, ages 6 and up. The game title comes from the many ways in which a player can negate the progress of another while issuing an apologetic sorry. That's right, we're looking at sorry tonight on Jay's Retro Toys and Games. And it's Monday, January 9th, 2023, the first show of the 2023 year. Happy New Year to all of you. This is episode 42, and I'm your host, Jason DeCanio, and we welcome you to this edition of Jay's Retro Toys and Games. Well, let's look at this game of Sorry that's been around since 1929. The objective is to be the first player to get all 4 of their colored pawns from their start space around the board to their home space. The pawns are normally moved in a clockwise direction but can be moved backward if directed. Movement of pawns is directed by the drawing of a card. The board game is laid out in a square with 16 spaces per side, with each player assigned their own colored start location and home locations offset towards the center, 1 per side. 4 5 square paths, 1 per color, lead from the common outer path towards a player's home and are designated their safety zone. On each side are 2 slides, grouping 4 or 5 spaces each. Now, older versions of Sorry contain a colored diamond space, directly 1 space back from each start square. A pawn of the diamond's color may not move forward over this square. Instead, a pawn of that color must diverge from the outer space square towards their home. The diamond space and corresponding rule were removed from subsequent editions. Now, William Henry Storey of Southend-on-Sea filed for a patent for the game in England, where it was registered as a trademark on May 21st of 1929. The UK number is 502898. And it was subsequently sold in the United Kingdom by Waddington's, the British games manufacturer who sold it from 1934. In the United States, U.S. patent 1,903,661 was filed for Sorry on August 4th, 1930 by William Henry Storey. The Canadian patent followed in 1932, and the U.S. patent was issued on April 11th, 1933. Sorry was adopted by Parker Brothers in 1934. Now, Hasbro continuously publishes it. So each player chooses 4 pawns of 1 color and places them in their start. 1 player is selected to play first, and each player in turn draws 1 card from the deck and follows its instructions. To begin the game, all of the player's 4 pawns are restricted to start. A player can only move them out onto the rest of the board if they draw a 1 or 2 card. A 1 or a 2 places a pawn on the space directly outside of start. A 2 does not entitle the pawn to move a second space. A pawn can jump over any other pawn during its move. However, 2 pawns cannot occupy the same square, and a pawn that lands on a square occupied by another player's pawn bumps that pawn back to its own start. Players cannot bump their own pawns back to start. It's the only way to complete a move would result in a player bumping their own pawn. The player's pawns remain in place and the player loses their turn. If a pawn lands at the start of a slide, except those of its own color, either by direct movement or as the result of a switch from an 11 card or a sorry card, it immediately slides to the last square of the slide. All pawns on all spaces of the slide, including those belonging to the sliding player, are sent back to their respective starts. The last 5 squares before each player's home are safety zones and are specially colored corresponding to the colors of the homes they lead to. Access is limited to pawns of the same color. Pawns inside the safety zones are immune to being bumped by opponents' pawns or being switched with opponents' pawns via the 11 or the sorry cards. However, if a pawn is forced via a 10 or a 4 card to move backward out of the safety zone, it is no longer considered safe and may be bumped by or switched with opponents' pawns as usual until it re-enters the safety zone. The modern deck contains 45 cards. There are 5 1 cards, as well as 4 each of the other cards. 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 10, and 12. There are no 6s or 9s. They are omitted to avoid confusion with each other. And the first edition of the game had 44 cards, 4 of each, and the extra 1 card was soon introduced as an option for quicker play. A 1996 board from Waddington's had 5 of each card. Cards are annotated with the following actions. The 1 card either moved a pawn from start or moved a pawn 1 space forward. In the 2013 edition, the player may also move ice before doing so. A number 2 card moved a pawn from start or moved a pawn 2 spaces forward. Drawing a 2 entitles the player to draw again at the end of their turn. Now, if the player cannot use a 2 to move, they can still draw again. In the 2013 edition, the player may also move fire as part of this card's effect. 3 moves the pawn 3 spaces forward. 4 is 4 spaces. 5 is 5. Now, if you move 1 pawn 7 spaces forward, or split the 7 spaces between 2 pawns, such as 4 spaces for 1 pawn and 3 for another, this makes it possible for 2 pawns to enter home on the same turn, for example. The 7 cannot be used to move a pawn out of start, even if the player splits it into a 6 and 1 or a 5 and 2. The entire 7 spaces must be used or their turn ends. The player cannot move their pawn backwards with a split. 8 moves the pawn 8 spaces forward. 10 spaces forward or 1 space backward. Now, if none of the player's pawns can move 10 spaces, then 1 pawn must move back 1 space. And 11 does 11 spaces forward or switches the places of one of the player's own pawns and an opponent's pawn. A player who cannot move 11 spaces is not forced to switch and instead can end their turn. An 11 cannot be used to switch a pawn that is in a safety zone. 12 moves the pawn 12 spaces forward. Now, the sorry card, take any 1 pawn from start and move it directly to a square occupied by any opponent's pawn, sending that pawn back to its own start. A sorry card cannot be used on an opponent's pawn in a safety zone or at the home base. If there are no pawns on the player's start or no opponent's pawns on any space that can be moved to, the turn ends. The 2013 version, the player can also move any of their pawns forward 4 spaces. If the player cannot move forward 4 after there are no pawns in start or no opponent pawn or any space, the turn is forfeited. So, strategy. The 7 can be split, so it's often possible to do so such that one of the pieces ends up on a slide, thus increasing the value of this card. It also provides an additional opportunity for pawns to get home, so long as there's another pawn on the board to use up the remaining spaces. All other things being equal, moves that cause a pawn to end up in front of an opponent's start square are poor choices due to the higher number of cards that allow the opponent to enter. Some feel that leaving a pawn on one's own square just outside start, also known as the dot, is a poor position to be in since new pawns are blocked from entering play. There are numerous strategies and tactics employed by skilled players. One such strategy is to leave the last pawn in the start square and move the other pawns around the board while waiting for a sorry card. And due to the 11 switching places, 4 moving backwards is noted as above, or sorry, allowing the player to send virtually any pawn back to its start cards, the lead in the game can change dramatically in a short amount of time. Players are very rarely so far behind as to be completely out of the game, and this should be considered when playing a sorry or an 11. Leaving one of your pawns near your start space will allow to give you the advantage to move backwards and make it into your safety zone or close enough without having to go all around the board. Slowing the game down is a risky yet effective move when given the opportunity. Essentially, when a player has the chance to switch with or hit the apparent leader, even though the move will not be to the player's immediate advancement around the board, the move should be made to keep the leader out of safety and, more importantly, out of home. You have a point-scoring sorry. You can play with teams. You can use sorry with fire and ice power-ups. There was a video game in 1998. There was a version of it. In the Hoyle Table Games collection of computer games, the game Bump'em is similar to Sorry. There's an Express version, and there's also a game called Sorry Not Sorry. It's an adult-themed edition of Sorry, which consisted of the classic game but added several cards, each containing a have you ever question. Upon drawing, the player must ask an opponent the fill-in-the-blank question printed on the card. The game was part of Hasbro's collection of parody versions of their classic games, which included The Game of Life, Operation, and Clue, which were respectively retitled The Game of Life, Quarter Life Crisis, Botched Operation, and Clue, What Happened Last Night, Lost in Vegas. Well, there you have it in a nutshell. Sorry in all of its glory. Good game? Yes. Haven't played it in a long time myself. But for what it's worth, it brings back a lot of memories. So, with that, we're going to be looking at the next game in our series, which is going to be Ludo, or Cludio Clue, which is Clue. Murder mystery game for 3 to 6 players, depending on the editions. Was devised in 1943 by British board game designer Anthony E. Pratt, and first manufactured by Waddington's in the United Kingdom in 1949. So we'll look at that great Clue history, the marketing, and all of its glory. Cludio. The characters, the weapons, the rooms, it's all coming back to you. The rules and all of it. This Wednesday on the next edition of Jay's Retro Toys and Games. I'm Jason DeCanio. Thank you very much for joining me here tonight. We hope that you had a grand time. And remember, always, to be honest, be real, and keep it simple, stupid. Kiss. We will see you on Wednesday. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Democracy Network for great more content like this one.